June heat rolls over Camp Verde, Texas, in 1857. On the parade ground, long legs fold and kneel on command. Leather creaks and a harsh, nasal groan cuts the air. An officer's ledger records a number that surprises anyone raised on horse and mule tails. 75 camels on the U.S. Army's rolls. They are Army property, imported by order of the United States government. 2 years earlier, Congress set aside $30,000 for a War Department experiment to solve a stubborn problem: how to move freight across the arid Southwest where water holes vanish and soft sand swallows wagons. By 1857, there are about 75 animals at Camp Verde with experienced handlers. The intent is practical. In true deserts, camels carry more weight and stop for water far less often than mules. Quartermaster notes, more honest than folklore, repeat the same verdict. They work. The problem did not begin as romance. It began as arithmetic. Between forts and depots stretched miles of bad road. If there was a road at all, country of mesquite and greasewood and stone, country that tests animals as cruelly as it tests people. A string of mules drinks even while standing still in this heat. A string of camels chews and waits. Put the same burden on each and push them across loose ground and you find the same result written again and again in supply records. The mule strings falter, the camels do not. The idea's patron in Washington was the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. He read the reports from officers and explorers who had seen camels at work in North Africa and the Near East. He read of weight carried, water saved, heat endured. He set his name to an appropriation that did not promise cavalry glory, only better delivery of freight through country that punished hooves. Congress approved $30,000 in 1855. The War Department moved quickly from speculation to procurement, assigning Army Major Henry C. Wayne to oversee the enterprise and pairing him with a naval officer who knew how to move cargo across oceans, Lieutenant David Dixon Porter. The ship was the USS Supply. The orders were simple in principle and complicated in practice. Acquire camels well-suited to hard service, acquire gear and saddles and people who knew how to use them, then bring animal, gear, and skill together at a new frontier post, Camp Verde. The first load of camels came by sea, not across a desert, and that voyage alone proved part of the thesis. The animals were more adaptable to close quarters than their critics claimed, more resilient to changes of climate and feed. Others followed. The Army acquired more than animals. It hired knowledge. Men who had lived with camels, who spoke to them with hands and voice and body. Men known on the frontier by a name that stuck: cameleers. One of them, remembered in American mouths as High Jolly, became a familiar figure on desert roads. A reminder that experiments do not run on appropriations alone. They run on people who know how to do the thing others are only reading about. By 1857, the parade ground at Camp Verde showed a sight the West had not seen before. Camels kneeling to be saddled with government freight, rising under loads that made mules snort and dancers step back. The Army took notes with the same patience that it loaded cargo. How far between water? How much weight per animal? What forage could they take when grass was scarce and the ground offered only thorn and scrub? The answers pleased the quartermasters. These animals were not just curiosities. They were solutions in search of routes. A camel train does not behave like a mule string. They kneel to load. They rise with weights that would stagger a mule. They browse on different plants, taking what the country offers without stripping the same grasses horses and mules require. They drink far less often. They go days without water where a mule string would halt and refit and hope for a spring. They walk with a long pendulum stride that ignores crusted sand where hooves punch through. The differences that made them awkward in a horse culture were the same differences that made them practical in dry country. A handler learned to avoid the mouth, respect the kick, and work with the animal's instinct to kneel when pressed. A quartermaster learned to count miles in longer segments and to plan water stops farther apart. Trials within the post could only prove so much. A demonstration inside a corral can be made to flatter. The Army needed proof over distances measured on maps and blamed on the sun. The next step was to move real cargo across a real route. The Southwest needed roads as well as freighting, and the government wanted a line opened along the 35th parallel, from the interior to the Pacific. In 1857, an expedition set out under Edward Fitzgerald Beale to blaze that way. Horses and mules went, and so did camels. The desert counseled its usual caution, and the animals answered with the one language the desert respects. Miles covered with freight still on their backs. Much of the way was scrub, basin, wind that lifts grit into the mouth and eyes, distances that look short at dawn and long by noon. There is no way to pretty that up. It is exactly the kind of march that exposes a weak animal and crowns a strong one. Day by day the camels made their case. They did not flinch at crusted sand. They did not burn through water like mules. They took heavy loads off and on without constant fuss. When the party reached the army outpost near Los Angeles after a route on the order of 1,200 miles, the freight had not walked itself. The camels carried it. The reports that followed read like a supply officer's careful praise. Heavier loads carried, fewer animals lost, and no collapsing teams at dry camps. Numbers anchor this story. In 1855, the War Department received a $30,000 appropriation for camels. By 1857, Camp Verde listed about 75 animals. In 1857 and 1858, a camel detachment completed an approximately 1,200-mile haul from Texas to the Los Angeles area across arid country. Measured by water taken, weight carried, and miles logged, the animals met the brief. No one in the army expected camels to replace cavalry horses in a charge, and no one argued that camels should replace mules in every corner of the service. The point was narrower and more practical. For hauling freight over hot, dry expanses where water is scarce and the ground punishes hooves, the camels were a sound answer. The close-in details from those marches survive in journals and letters. The camels took to dry country like animals bred for it because that is what they were. They crossed stretches that had defeated wagons behind exhausted teams and drifted forward under loads that would have humbled shorter-winded stock. They alarmed horses at first. Any new smell will do that, but traveled without drama once men learned that spooking is often a failure of habit, not fate. The handlers worked out saddles that spread the weight across a back shaped for cargo, not for riders, and the quartermasters revised their arithmetic to match. A camel could carry heavy freight and ask for water less often. You could push farther between springs. You could move when the map warned you not to. The army tried other uses because no institution leaves a promising tool without tinkering. There were messages sent at speed and officers who learned, after the first spluttering laughter, that a camel, properly ridden, could cover ground in a respectable time when a message needed carrying. But the strength of the animal in America was freight, not dispatch riding. It was hauling timber and stone and flour and ammunition over country that tired men and emptied canteens. It was pointing at a line on a map and making it real. Even practicality must bend to politics and war. In 1861, the nation tore itself in two. Priorities moved east. Money, officers, and attention shifted to an existential fight. The camel experiment had proven what it needed to prove, but experiments do not thrive when an institution has to fight for its life in battles far away. The herd lost its patrons. Funds that once moved animals from port to post now moved regiments from state to state. Within a few years, the program was wound down. Animals were auctioned or transferred to private owners who put them to work in circuses, mines, and rail construction. Others were turned loose and roamed. Frontier papers noted odd silhouettes for years. A tall outline on a ridge at dusk, a bell clanking where no cattle grazed. The government experiment ended not because the animals failed in the desert, but because a nation at war stopped investing in a narrow solution. The paper trail remains plain. Appropriations in black ink. A herd count at Camp Verde near 750. The long journey to an outpost near Los Angeles recorded in the dry tone of official reporting. The auctions written down as items and lots and bids. It is not the kind of paperwork that sings in a ballad, but it is the kind of paperwork that keeps men honest. It says that in the late 1850s the U.S. Army imported camels and used them where deserts hurt. It says they did the job. It says the job ended because something larger stole the budget and the time. What the paper does not show is the way people looked when they first saw the animals. Imagine a teamster who has lived his life with mules, who can read a mule's ears like a watch. He sees a line of camels kneeling to be loaded, ropes snugged, blankets straight, the animals rising like ships in a swell when the load sits right. He smells something he does not like and hears a noise he has never heard. He decides in a single breath that he hates the new thing. Then he watches his old team blow hard and foam while the new thing chews and breathes slow, and 100 miles later, he runs out of curses because he is out of water and the new thing is not. The handlers earned their pay. A camel that does not like the way a man leans or pulls will kneel and refuse to be hurried. You cannot fight a kneeling camel to its feet any more than you can argue a wind into changing. You work around the animal's instincts. You learn where to stand and how to ask. You learn that the bite is a quick answer to a clumsy hand and that the kick is a memory you carry on your thigh for a month. You also learn that a good animal will recover from a long dry haul with a drink and a feed the way a mule does not, and that a good string run by a good crew can make a liar out of a map. The country itself shapes stories. East of the 100th meridian, water breaks the land into farms and creeks. West of it, the water breaks your plans. The army discovered that the arithmetic of water controls every mile. How many canteens for how many men and animals for how many days between one known source and the next. You can cheat that calculation only with experience or luck. The camel brings a third-way biology. An animal built for dry distances changes the map you are willing to risk. Men argued then about what is obvious to us now. They said the animals were too strange to integrate smoothly into posts built around horses and mules. They said the handlers needed were too few and too far between. They said a beast that frightened a cavalry mount was a liability on a parade ground even if it was an asset on a freight road. There is truth in the complaints. Integration costs time. But the desert does not care how you feel about a smell or a silhouette. It cares whether you brought enough water and whether the thing under your load will still be standing at sundown. There were small, telling comparisons conducted with a precision only the army loves. Loads were shifted between camels and mules. Distances were marked. The animals were ridden or driven along the same segments, and notes were taken on water consumed and time made. When all was written, the pencil pushed toward the same conclusion. On the kind of ground the experiment was designed for, the camel is a superior freight animal. It is crude to say so, and it cuts against the romance of the West that would harden later, but it is fact. Some of the animals went to California during the war years, not as soldiers but as workers, mixed into civilian hands who knew a bargain when they saw one. They hauled for rail construction. They hauled for mines. They hauled for shows. A camel at a fair draws a crowd in any country. A camel under load draws a foreman's attention when the grade turns mean in the sun. The same animal that satisfied an officer's ledger satisfied a contractor's schedule. A few were simply let loose. The reasons in the records are ordinary: no budget, no buyer, no staff. But the consequences put a shape on horizons where none had appeared before. For years, travelers looked up from a road and saw a moving outline that did not belong to cattle or horse. They stepped toward the shade and heard the faint clank of a bell and thought for a moment that they had walked into a tale. They had not. They had stumbled into an experiment's afterlife. The stories of those years include a figure who became a symbol as much as a man. The cameleer called High Jolly in American mouths stayed in the region after the government work ended. He kept at the business of moving through hard country, handling animals no one else knew how to handle. A living demonstration that practical knowledge outlives a contract. He died in Arizona and the stone over him remembers him as a camel driver, which is as honorable a title as a man could have in a place that makes liars out of maps. Remember what the experiment was and was not. It was not a scheme to turn cavalry into something out of a storybook. It was a logistics answer for a logistics problem. Getting flour to a fort keeps men from deserting. Getting ammunition to a post keeps a fight from going wrong. Getting timber to a place where no timber grows keeps a roof over heads and a wall between men and weather. If you can do those things farther between water stops with fewer animals lost, you have done more for the West than a dozen parades. When the Civil War ended, the army looked again at the desert and at the ledger. The country had changed. Railroads would soon cross where only wagon ruts had run. Telegraph lines meant messages no longer needed to ride in a hurry with a brave man on a fast horse unless the wire was down. The post-war army, smaller and sober, counted costs and kept to traditions. The camel had proven itself at its job. The job was changing. A program that would have made sense in 1859 made less sense in 1867 when a railhead could be promised within the decade and wagon roads would be graded by county crews instead of hasty details from a garrison. What endures is the testament of records that have no reason to flatter. Appropriation made. Animals purchased. Handlers hired. Training conducted. Marches completed. Loads delivered. Water saved. Program ended for reasons not connected to field failure. Animals dispersed through auctions and transfers. Sightings recorded. Stone markers set. It is a clean chain from idea to trial to outcome, and the cleanest part is the middle, when the animals did as asked and the desert yielded miles to their stride. Stand in that heat in your mind and watch a train set out. The animals kneel. The loads descend from hands that have done this before. Straps tighten. A command is given and the animals rise like slow, patient waves lifting freight into motion. The map is a line of wells, a small town, a river with pretensions, a line of mountains the color of old iron. The country between is what the appropriation was meant to solve. The column moves into it as if the line on the map were real. By evening it is. The road behind is not dust anymore. It is proof. The popular image of the West is a horse under a rider silhouetted at evening. Keep that picture. It is honest for some parts of the story. Add another that is equally honest. A line of camels under freight, heads up, walking as if the day were a simple thing. A man on foot alongside, a man behind, a man ahead, all working instead of dreaming. The romance of work is a quieter thing, but it holds a country together. The next time a story insists that the West was only horses and mules, remember a ledger at Camp Verde and a route to Los Angeles. Remember $30,000 written into law for a practical test. Remember 75 animals on the Army's rolls in 1857. Remember a march on the order of 1,200 miles, not a boast but an entry in a report. Remember an experiment that concluded not in failure but in redirection, because the nation's fight moved to other ground and budgets follow battles. Remember animals sold to men who knew a good idea when they saw one, and animals turned loose whose shapes startled travelers for years. And remember this because it is the quiet point that does not fit on a parade ground. If you measure by water, by weight, and by miles, the camel earns its place. The myth prefers a different silhouette, but the ledger does not lie. The animals did not appear in Texas by magic. They came by ship, and even that part of the story shows how deliberate the experiment was. The War Department paired an Army officer who knew what the service needed with a naval officer who knew how to move awkward cargo across oceans without losing it. Major Henry C. Wayne handled the procurement and the training plan. Lieutenant David Dixon Porter commanded the USS Supply and the sea legs of the operation. They sailed to the Mediterranean in 1855 and 1856, not to guess, but to buy animals from places that had used them hard for centuries. They chose dromedaries for speed and endurance and brought in pack saddles and gear fit for those backs. They also hired men who knew the animals, because a beast is only as useful as the hands that set its load and ask it to move. When the first load of camels came off the deck at Indianola, Texas in 1856, they stepped onto a coastline not used to their outlines. Crates opened, ramps set, and the animals set their feet on Gulf sand under a sun that felt familiar enough. The landing made news because anything strange does, and because the project represented a new kind of practicality in a place that still measured progress in miles of road graded and posts supplied. The animals walked inland from the port to Camp Verde under the same eyes that would judge them for years. Skeptical teamsters, curious soldiers, and quartermasters with short tempers for things that did not work. The first weeks at Camp Verde were the ones that could have undone the entire idea. A new post learning a new animal is one accident away from declaring the entire business foolish. Instead, the animals settled. The handlers taught soldiers how to approach a kneeling camel and where not to stand. They sorted out feed that made sense for the local browse and learned which thorns the animals would take with no complaint and which needed to be avoided. Saddles were adjusted to spread weight across a spine meant for a different kind of burden than a horse or mule carries. The first runs were short and close, then longer and honest. Water discipline became calculation rather than panic. Men learned that a camel can be full of opinions and still be reliable, and that opinions are cheaper than broken axles in country like this. Comparative trials were the way to turn impressions into policy. In those, the army did what it always does when it is serious: it measured. A string of mules would be loaded with a specific weight, a string of camels with another, and the parties would take the same route on the same day toward the same water. Notes were made on time, condition, forage taken, and water consumed. When the route went through crusted sand, the camels walked on and the hooves sank. When the route ran short on water, the mules impatiently pulled toward scent and the camels continued at the same walking speed with their heads held high. At the end of a long day, the mules needed more water than the country offered. The camels wanted less than the quartermaster had set aside. At the end of a long week, the camels' backs were not raw, their legs not blown, their attitudes no worse than any animal that has listened to men talk while they work in heat. News of the experiment traveled without the army's help. A post-hostler wrote to a cousin, and that letter moved faster than any circular. A visiting civilian saw the parade ground, watched the camels kneel to be loaded, and took that picture back to a town where news was both entertainment and education. Soldiers transferred and carried their stories from post to post. None of those words were meant as a recruiting pamphlet. They were ordinary talk about animals that did not need a water barrel at every stop and loads that no one had to shift to a relief team at midday. Outside Texas, the most important trial played out along a line that mattered to more than soldiers. A route west had to be marked and improved along the 35th parallel, a path that would be road, mail line, and supply route. Edward Fitzgerald Beale led the expedition that laid that line down. The animals included horses and mules and camels. The camels were not for show. They hauled freight, kept pace, and made the mathematics of water less cruel. A dry camp that would break a mule string was simply another day when the camels were in the line. A stretch of crusted ground that looked like a trap for wheels was an ordinary day for their feet. The men on that expedition learned what the Camp Verde quartermasters had already written down. When the country turns dry and wide, a camel turns work into distance. Beale's reports used the tone that makes a clerk yawn and a commander pay attention. He described loads and mileages, feed and water, routes and delays. He spent his words on things that decide whether a project becomes a road or a tale. The camels moved heavy loads with fewer water stops and no special drama. They upset some horses at first, but also trained some men to expect that a horse will learn as surely as a soldier does. When the expedition reached California, the camels were not a curiosity. They were a reason the line had made sense even in bad stretches. The government got what it had paid for: proof on the ground. Cameleers gave the project its backbone. The army could purchase animals and saddles. Experience had to be hired. The man remembered as High Jolly showed what that meant every day. He taught soldiers and civilian teamsters how to work with the animals rather than against them. He added hours to the day by wasting none of them in arguments no camel could win and no man could survive. He showed that sound handling looks like calm, and that calm looks like competence when the sun is overhead and a road has miles left in it. When the army's experiment wound down, he stayed on in the country because the roads and jobs that needed camels did not vanish simply because a ledger was closed. All of the ordinary things that make an animal useful had to be learned by men who had grown up with horses and mules. How to load without making a sore that turns a tool into a patient. How to set a schedule that suits the animal's strengths. How to keep camp in a way that respects the way a camel eats, rests, and rises. A mulesmith's instincts help some and mislead some. A handler had to learn new reflexes and forget others. That learning curve is what kills many experiments. Men are slow to change when the old way works tolerably. The fact that this project got past those first months to the point where long routes were completed shows that the learning did happen and that the work paid for itself. There were limits that the army could see clearly as well. A camel is not a cavalry charger. It does not answer the spur like a horse, and it does not belong in a formation that must pivot and gallop on command in a thunder of hooves. A camel does not take part in a parade as well as a horse does because it is not built for the same cues or work. A camel is a freight animal that drinks less, eats rougher browse, and walks longer under heavy loads. The project was never supposed to make the animal into something it was not. It was supposed to put the right animal on the right road. Those right roads were not few. Posts across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and into California had to be supplied. Timber had to be brought where no trees grew, stone where no quarry was close, flour to posts with no mills, ammunition to men posted far from water. It is easy to think of the West as an open stage for individual action. The daily life of the West was more often a supply problem. Soldiers fought when told, but they also dug wells, repaired roofs, patrolled lines, and waited for wagons. A train that arrived on time changed morale as much as a letter from home. The Civil War changed every calculation at a stroke. The army that had nurtured the experiment was broken into halves. Men who had written orders for camels wrote orders to raise regiments instead. Governors argued over quotas instead of feed. The experiment had strong backing when the problem it solved was near the center of the army's attention. When the Eastern War swallowed every resource, the Camel Corps was not so much abandoned as drowned by bigger demands. The herd at Camp Verde was still there. The animals still worked when asked. The office that had written for them now wrote for something else, and those pages moved first. In the early and middle years of the 1860s, the remaining camels were shifted, sold, or left to holders who knew what to do with them. A few went to California depot custody before being disposed of there. Others remained in Texas until the end of the war made auctions possible. The sales did not come with speeches. They came with lot numbers and bids. The buyers were not lecturers on animal science. They were circus agents who knew a draw, mine bosses who knew a grade, and rail contractors who knew a deadline. The same backs that carried army cargo carried timber and ore and scrap and pipe and tools. The same stride that ignored crusted sand ignored ballast and shale. Circuses made stories because spectacle always does. A camel in a tent is a line in a handbill and a grin on a child's face. A camel on a mountain switchback is not a spectacle, but the route runs faster because the animal is not looking for a creek every day. In mines across Nevada and into the California ranges, the animals hauled where engine power had not yet reached and where mules burned out too fast for the wage budget. On rail grades, they moved sections and kegs and water for men, a fact written in payroll ledgers and remembered in foreman's talk long after the last spike. A government program's end rarely coincides with the end of the work the program did. That is why the animals persisted in private use and on the hoof without owners. Trails and towns recorded them by accident. A ranch hand glimpsed one at long distance and told the cook that night, and the whole camp spent a little longer listening under the stars than usual. A freight wagon driver from nowhere in particular startled at a shape against the sky and wrote to his brother about it, to be laughed at and believed in equal measure. A stage passenger told a story in a depot and another passenger wrote it down. Those fragments make a kind of echo that tells you the thing happened often enough to leave a ring in the air. Some stories grew beyond ordinary sightings. In Arizona Territory, newspapers in the 1880s printed accounts of a tall, reddish animal that entered gardens and left when shot at, that carried something on its back no one could identify from a distance. Those accounts grew into tales and those tales into legend. The names and adjectives grew faster than the facts, as they always do when a good story aligns with a memory of something that was once true and strange in the country. Peel away the color and you are left with what you would expect. A few camels still at large decades after the end of the government program, seen by people who were not expecting them and remembered more vividly because of that surprise. The cameleers' own stories are part of this afterlife. Some returned to the places they had come from. Some stayed because the country had given them a trade and because the roads and the work were there before the money and would be there after. A man who can move freight in hard country can feed himself as long as other men need freight moved. The stone over High Jolly in Arizona, set later by people who remembered him clearly enough to mark the place, says enough without embellishment. He was the man who knew how to handle the animals that had done a job others did not expect to be done. In the years after the war, the Army's attention went back to the West in different forms. Posts were built and abandoned. Lines were held and lost. Wars were fought and recounted in memoirs that did not linger on packed trains. Railroads took up work that animals had done. Telegraphs made distance smaller in the one way a wire can. The camel belonged to a particular moment when the Army needed to move heavy things across bad country and could not yet call a locomotive. That moment passed, but the record of it did not, and the desert did not either. If you put your hand on a map and trace from the Gulf Coast up toward Camp Verde and then west along the route Beale cut and then down into the basins where miners sank shafts and up the grades where rails were laid, you are tracing more than lines. You are tracing the shape of a problem and the life of a solution. The problem is water and weight and distance. The solution is an animal that carried more water inside itself and more weight on its back for more distance between springs. For a time, the army recognized that fit and paid to test it. Then the army turned away because history demanded it look elsewhere. The fit remained. Private men used it until a different solution, steel and steam, made the old one less necessary. There is a tendency in stories to demand victories that last forever or to call any temporary success a failure. Most work does not satisfy those demands. Most work accomplishes a necessary thing for as long as it is the best available way to do it. The camel in the American West fits that kind of work. It did what it was asked. It made some roads and kept some posts supplied and proved a point that can be seen every time a supply officer tallies water and weight in a hot country. It ended when other needs became louder. That is not failure. That is how solutions live in the world. The people closest to the animals did not need arguments about their worth. A teamster loading timber onto a kneeling back and standing clear of a sudden shift does not care about congressional debate from years before. He cares about daylight and whether the load will be at the worksite by noon. The animal rises and the road takes the weight and the day moves forward. A soldier waiting on flour at a post too far from water for a mule train in July does not care about whether a camel fits anyone's idea of the West. He cares about bread. When he gets it, he cares about it less because most necessities occupy our thoughts only when they are missing. The Army's papers have a habit of keeping both sides of a truth on the same shelf. The same file that holds the appropriation also holds the later orders to sell. The same set of letters that includes praise for the animals includes a note about a horse team spooked on a parade ground. The same ledger that sets out the 75 animals at Camp Verde also includes names of men who were reassigned east and did not return. If you read all of it as an argument, you choose a side and miss the point. If you read it as a record, you understand what happened and why, and the understanding is better than a victory song. A traveler in the 1870s might have crossed a valley and seen nothing but the usual, the tireless horizon, the closer dust, a hawk catching a thermal and banking toward a ridge, a streak of green where a spring has its say. That same traveler might have crossed at dusk and seen a darker shape against the low light, tall and still for a moment, then moving with a sway unfamiliar to an eye trained on horses and cattle. He might have told a friend about it years later, unsure if he had seen what he thought he'd seen. He might have said nothing because it sounded like a lie. The land listens to both kinds of men. It keeps its own counsel and does not correct our stories. At Camp Verde itself, ordinary time thickened around the places where the animals had been. A corral post that stopped holding a rope held a memory instead. A shed that kept feed kept the smell of it after the last sacks were gone. A soldier who had stood boredom's guard in the shade of a wall remembered the sound the animals made when they rose. A groan like a plank twisting under load. Years later, when he spoke of the post to a grandson, he would mention the animals before he remembered the names of officers. He would talk about heat and roads and how sometimes the right answer looks wrong until it arrives on its own legs and keeps walking past the water barrel without looking into it. The big story of the West is still too often told with just one animal and one silhouette. That does not make the story false. It makes it incomplete. The camel belongs in the margin where the work is done. It belongs beside the mule and the ox, the wagon and the sled, the depot and the post. It belongs in the file drawer labeled appropriations and in the one labeled auctions. It belongs on the parade ground for a moment and on the long road for days. It belongs in a ledger under the columns for gallons and pounds and miles, because that is where it was judged and found useful. There are photographs from later years that show camels in places where the army no longer kept them. A circus lot, a mining camp, a rough street in a desert town with a tent behind it and a bar in front of it. In those frames, the animals look both out of place and exactly right because any animal under load in a place built by loads belongs there. A miner's child looks at the camera and then at the animal with equal curiosity. A handler stands to the side with the kind of stance that says he has been kicked before and prefers not to be kicked again. These are not romantic pictures. They are working pictures. The facts that began this story remain the best way to end it. In 1855, the government set aside $30,000 to purchase and test camels for service in the deserts of the Southwest. By 1857, about 75 animals stood on the rolls at Camp Verde, Texas. In 1857 and 1858, a detachment using camels moved freight on the order of 1,200 miles from Texas to an army outpost near Los Angeles, and the reports that described that movement measured water, weight, and time in ways that favored the animals. The Civil War intervened. The experiment lost attention and funding. The animals were sold, transferred, or turned loose. Some worked for private owners in circuses, mines, and rail construction. Some roamed and were seen on roads and ranges for years afterward. The camels in America did their job while they had it. The job was not small. It made hard miles real. The ledger is what finally matters. It balances without pride. It does not love a horse more than a camel or a mule more than an ox. It loves numbers that add up. Water consumed per mile. Weight carried without injury. Miles covered between reliable sources. Men fed and posts supplied. That ledger says plainly that for specific roads under specific skies, the camel was the right answer. There is no need to argue with the sky. It is enough to have crossed under it with a load still tied tight at dusk.